Welcome back to the Brown Symposium for our final talk. We're going to hear a perspective on the role of fashion in attraction, sex, and romance. And to introduce our speaker is Carrie Bechtel, who is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of Theater. Carrie.
Hello, everyone. I will be introducing, it's my honor to introduce our final speaker today. As a costume designer, I am always researching different kinds of clothing. And oftentimes this comes into period undergarments, stays, corsets, girdles, brassieres, and I'm very interested in the ways in which these garments and the bodies that they cover have been fetishized. And no one knows this kind of information better than Valerie Steele. Because her scholarship lives at the intersection of historical relevance, anthropology, sociology, and popular culture, she's often asked to speak in both academic venues and more mainstream settings, such as the Oprah Winfrey Show. With a PhD from Yale University, Dr. Steele has edited, authored, and co-authored more than 24 books on Western fashion, including Fetish, Fashion, Sex, and Power, The Corset, A Cultural History, Men and Women, Dressing the Part of Fashion, and Eroticism, Ideals of Feminine Beauty from the Victorian Era to the Jazz Age. Dr. Steele was appointed director of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in 2003 and has curated more than 25 exhibitions over the last 20 years, including Love and War, The Weaponized Woman, The Corset, Fashioning the Body, Gothic Dark Glamour, and A Queer History of Fashion. Regarded as one of the pioneers in the study of fashion and its cultural significance, Dr. Steele is also the founder and editor-in-chief of Fashion Theory, the Journal of Dress, Body, and Culture. It's a peer-reviewed scholarly journal in fashion studies, and it takes as its starting point a definition of fashion as a cultural construction of the embodied identity. It provides an interdisciplinary forum for the rigorous analysis of cultural phenomena ranging from foot binding to fashion advertising. Dr. Steele's online bio states that she combines serious scholarship with a rare ability to communicate with general audiences. So we can expect a fascinating, immaculately researched, and extremely accessible lecture on fashion and sexual attraction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerie Steele to Southwestern University and the Brown Symposium's virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Hi, Ben, why don't we get the first image up? And the first real image too. The next one. Great. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to talk to all of you, but I have some very interesting images and information to share, and I look forward to chatting with you electronically after my talk. It's about the relationship between fashion and sexual attraction. And looking at this picture of Liz Hurley in Versace's safety pin dress and Hugh Grant in a tuxedo, what do you think the relationship is? Liz Hurley is certainly revealing a lot of skin. Her Versace dress is slid up to the thigh, and it's also open along a strip of her torso. In addition, there's a very deep décolletage, which emphasizes and partly exposes her breasts. Her dress looks sexy in part because it's showing a lot of her body. Fashion is intimately related to the body, which is a big part of its sexual appeal, but that's not all. By contrast, Hugh Grant's tux is not revealing much of his body. Yet plain dark suits do not simply conceal or deny the man's body. As Anne Hollander observed in her wonderful book, Sex and Suits, the tailored suit subtly idealizes the male body. At least when it's well made and well fitted, it corrects any flaws and makes the body look, in a sense, even better. Furthermore, this tuxedo also gives Hugh's body a particular look, which carries associations which might reveal something about himself, his individual and social identity, which might be sexually attractive. A tuxedo says, among other things, that he's sophisticated, upper class, or at least an elite sort of person. Now, her dress also seems to reveal something of her identity, at least in a playful way. The safety pins, for example, allude to the punk subculture. Is there something sexy about that? It's also a Versace dress, and Versace is a brand which is very much about an in-your-face kind of sexiness, which has been controversial over the years. Now, whether you're male or female, as you look at this, you might think to yourself, your body is indeed an important part of yourself. It's how you perceive the world is through your body. But you probably also feel that you're more than just your body. And that's where fashion comes in. Because just as your mind and your body can't be separated, together, intermingled, they make up who you are, so also are fashion and the embodied subjectivity, yourself, your body, mind, are also inextricably connected. You might even argue, in a sense, that fashion is or can be part of yourself. Ben, let's get the next image. Fashion is often dismissed as superficial, a matter of surface appearances, shallow, not deep, and by extension, not serious, meaningful, or important. It's true that fashion is literally superficial, since it exists primarily on the surface of the body next to the skin, or as an extension of the body. Yet I would argue that fashion is profoundly meaningful precisely because of its intimate relationship with the fleshy human body, and by extension with an individual's subjective sense of identity. Fashion, this second skin, not only serves as a vital interface between the self and the world, the self and other people, but may even be said to constitute a part of the self. Next, please. Evolutionary biologists, and you've been hearing from some of them today, argue that heterosexual men are hardwired to be attracted to young women with curvy bodies, soft skin, and lush hair. And there's a lot of truth to that. But it doesn't explain why men and women have fashioned their bodies in so many different ways. For that, we need to look also at history, anthropology, and psychology. And specifically, I would argue, psychoanalysis, which pays the most attention to an individual's life experiences, from the bodily sensations of earliest infancy to the picture of our body, which we form in our mind. Next picture. Human beings are born naked, but everywhere their bodies are dressed or fashioned in some way. So what does that mean? Is this little baby naked? Let me ask you this. Can you tell if it's a boy or a girl? Haha, bet you can tell it's a girl. It's wearing a pale pink little headband. And even if it weren't pale pink, just the headband alone would be cluing you in that it was a girl. Somebody, probably the mother, put that little hairband on the baby to tell you this is a girl. And what about the cute way that the baby's been positioned? Parents dress their babies in many ways, leaving their mark, what they think is important. And very often what they want to emphasize is whether the baby is a boy or a girl, and they have very particular ideas of what a masculine or feminine little person would be like. Next. Dress in the anthropological sense is not limited to clothing that covers the body. And you saw that in the last picture too, because that little headband didn't cover very much of her body. Dress also encompasses any type of addition to or modification of the body. So this little Kayapo girl from the Amazon has been dressed in a bead necklace and body paint. Tattoos and tuxedos, high heels and hairstyles, all of these are forms of dress. Next. Fashion is not just trendy designer clothes. Fashion is a subcategory of dress, formerly defined in terms of European modernity and a regular pattern of style change. As Shakespeare said, fashion fashion is a deformed thief. that changes all the time, much faster than you wear out your clothes. So there's a pattern of style change. But nowadays, fashion is more often defined more generally as a cultural construction of the embodied identity. And we recognize that fashion exists in a lot of ancient and non-Western civilizations too. It's fashion in a sense is whatever you put on your body or do to your body to say who you are. Now, some people tell me that they're not interested in fashion. Many men say this to me, I'm not interested in fashion. I don't wear fashion. And I always say, does your mom choose your clothes? And they usually have to say, no, of course not, of course not. Ever since you were a little kid, you chose your own clothes. And especially since you were an adolescent, because adolescents are very particular about trying to use their clothes to tell people about who you are. And you're definitely not you're the same as your parents. So you might want to look sexually attractive, but that's not the only thing on your mind when you get dressed every morning. So consider puberty. Some of you are not very far out of puberty, and it has all kinds of physical changes. During adolescence, young people often use clothes to conceal or reveal how their bodies are becoming sexually mature. They also experiment with clothes, trying to figure out what kind of person are they. Are they a preppy? Are they a goth? Are they a hipster? And they try and use clothes to distinguish themselves from their parents or from other people, and to establish ties with their peers who have their own dress codes. And here you see someone who's wearing, chunky boots and pants, even though she's a girl, but she definitely has a kind of feminine, cool look. It's also a very fashionable look. All those double G's for Gucci make this quite inexpensive as well as a hip kind of outfit. And her whole body language is also telling you a lot about what kind of a person she's presenting herself as. And it's not necessarily someone that you would want to take home to a very conservative family. So she's making statements. But the bigger question is, why do we wear clothes at all? And I'm going to take the next image. We'll look at a few ideas that have come up about why we're wearing clothes. Next. According to the biblical story, after Adam and Eve, our first parents, ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And when God called them, they felt ashamed and hid from him. And before he expelled them from paradise, God made garments and clothed them. This has been known as the modesty or lust-shame theory of dress. And notice in the description in the Bible the significance of sight. Their eyes were opened and they knew they were naked. Before that, their nakedness was innocent, or they didn't really realize they were naked. You can see that artists have a hard time trying to figure out how to do this. On the one hand, they show them innocently, but as it were accidentally already hidden by fig leaves, even before Eve has gotten Adam to eat the apple. In the second one, a wonderful painting by Masaccio, they're shown being driven from the Garden of Eden completely naked and ashamed. And Eve is trying to hide her breasts and her genitals, and Adam is looking down, covering his eyes. So in ancient Israel, nakedness was regarded as degraded and shameful, while clothing was associated with the glorious garment of divinity. But indeed, throughout most of the ancient Middle Eastern world, in Egypt and Babylon, as well as in ancient Israel, nakedness was associated with shame and lack. By contrast, let's look at the next image. In ancient Greece, idealized nakedness, nudity, especially male nudity, was celebrated and associated both with ideal beauty and with clarity of vision. So with the Greek philosopher Plato, the metaphor of the naked truth became linked to the idea of knowledge as the unveiling of a mystery. So clothing veiled and concealed. In a way, clothing was deceptive, and you had to rip it away to find the truth. Next image. Within the Euro-American tradition, the fig leaf was widely interpreted as the first sort of proto-item of clothing. The Victorians often covered the genitals of Greek and Roman statues with fig leaves. Yet the fig leaf was a very ambivalent symbol, as cartoonists of the time pointed out, because it calls attention to what it tries to hide. Next. There is no simple opposition between being clothed and being naked, writes Ruth Barkan, because different cultures and eras have different ideas about what constitutes nakedness and, quote, what counts as clothes. In an article about nakedness and the colonial imagination, Philippa Levine points out that, quote, the politics and aesthetics of nakedness was for the Victorians both complex and slippery, the result of ambivalent 19th century attitudes towards the naked body, end quote. Whereas Freud and his contemporaries have been brought up to regard the heroic male nude of Greek antiquity as the pinnacle of civilized aesthetic, they were equally conditioned to interpret, quote, the unclothed African, Australian, Aboriginal, or Pacific Islander in terms of, quote, primitiveness and savagery, end quote. European colonialists and missionaries constantly complained about the insufficient attire and lack of shame exhibited by colonized peoples, who of course had their own standards of dress and thought that they were perfectly appropriately dressed. Next. By the late 19th century, European ethnologists have begun to argue that decoration and specifically sexual display, rather than sexual modesty, might be the real meaning of dress and adornment. From the penis sheaths and beaded aprons of low-tech cultures, next, to European fashions like codpieces and bustles. In discussions about the origin and meaning of clothes, with some saying modesty and others saying sexual display with a real ultimate purpose of clothes and dress, a third group argued that the primary purpose of dress was protection against the cold, for example, but also psychological or magical protection against dangers like the evil eye. Next. The protection theory has been given short shrift by most dress scholars. And I have to confess that in my own work for a long time, I thought, oh, of course it's all about sexual display and status display and communication. It's not about protection. But I should have been aware that, you know, the great fashion historian Anne Hollander was one of the few dress historians who declared that it was nature herself who, quote, ordains that human beings be completed with clothing, not left bare in their own insufficient skins, end quote. And if you start to look at things in terms of evolutionary biology, it's true that in contrast to most animals, which have a coat of fur, feathers, or scales, human bodies are covered only with a relatively thin membrane, actually a series of membranes, of skin and a light washing of hair. Homo sapiens is not actually the naked ape, but it's rather, quote, the only existing primate species lacking in functionally effective thermally heating fur, end quote. This makes humans, quote, more vulnerable to both high and low temperatures, as well as UV radiation, wounds, and insect bites. Our nakedness must be related to either natural selection or sexual selection. And I'm going to assume that you know what both of those are. Chances of survival or being sexually attractive, like the stag's extravagant antlers or the plumage of many male birds. Now, why though would humans be naked? Why would that have evolved? There have been many hypotheses and none have been able to be proved for sure. There's the cooling device hypothesis, neoteny hypothesis, adaptation against ectoparasites hypothesis. I, however, am particularly intrigued by Charles Darwin's hypothesis. He singled out naked skin as, quote, the prime bodily ornament of the human species. An ornament, moreover, that applies to the whole body. Now, if you look at our nearest primate cousins, like chimpanzees, you'll find that they have little bits of hairless places, and often particularly around the genitals, as well as sometimes around the face. With humans, though, it's different. I didn't show you a picture of how apes have hairless hot spots, but you can just Google baboon and you'll see some flaming red hot spots around the genitals. And also around the mouth, you can see that's relatively hairless. But Homo sapiens grow hair precisely around the genitals and on the head, and for men around the mouth, and a few other places, around underarms, sometimes chest, but compared to a primate, they're mostly hairless. Next picture. So hairless skin, it has been argued, is not only the absence of protective hairs, quote, but an alternative form of bodily clothing selected over many generations. As Dr. Menninghaus argues, in this respect, it's analogous to the most elaborate ornaments of fur or plumage, except that precisely because naked skin is the only ornament, first and foremost through absences, it's able to function as the setting for additional ornaments. Here you see the male having lots of hair around the face. Get the next picture. And here you see how just the fact that the naked body is mostly hairless means that you can add additional ornamental markings, whether these are tattoos or fashion. And in that way, it could be said that naked skin is, quote, a superb feat of sexual selection, and that clothing is a way to add on to that naked skin. Next image, please. Certainly, throughout world history, we find the virtually universal refusal of nudity, at least as far back as the Neolithic age, and in cultures around the world. Humans have always done something to their bodies, even if they only applied body paint or tattooed themselves or wore a string around the hips, perhaps with a penis sheath, a cash sex, a little apron of leaves. Today's fashions also, I would argue, may be ornamental markings that signal, among other things, sexual attraction, but also identity with whatever tribe we belong to. Next. You may have heard about Otzi the Iceman, a 5,300-year-old mummy discovered at the border between Italy and Switzerland. He was marvelously preserved, and they found him wearing clothes and shoes, mostly of animal hide, as well as 61 tattoos. These are reconstructions of what he would have looked like in the clothes that they found pieces of around him. Other archaeological finds include bodies that were buried with thousands of carefully carved ivory beads that formed jewelry patterns on the body. The significance, protection, including probably magic protection, also probably display, including sex, gender, communication, his tribal identification, and many people argue aesthetics. So in order to try and look more beautiful, as that was defined, or at least to look more special. Next. Although many people insist that human standards of beauty are entirely cultural and have nothing to do with natural or sexual selection, this has repeatedly been disproved. Beauty is not a myth, writes the scientist and psychologist Nancy Etkoff, author of this wonderful book, Survival of the Prettiest, The Science of Beauty. Drawing on cognitive science and evolutionary biology, she explains why certain bodies, faces, and fashions are more desirable than others. And you've heard others today, such as David, also talked about the evolutionary roots of our mating behavior and ideals of beauty. I came across some of the evidence that they cite when I was working on my book, The Corset, which was devoted to the controversial fashion that lasted from the 16th to the 20th centuries, more than 400 years. We get the next image. Indeed, I would argue that the corset never really disappeared, but rather over the years of, particularly over the course of the 20th century, it was gradually internalized in the form of diet, exercise, and plastic surgery and liposuction. The corset was closely associated with feminine beauty. And you can see this very well in this painting, Nana, by Edouard Manet. One reason it was associated with feminine beauty is because it enhanced the sexually dimorphic waist-hip differential, which is always mentioned by evolutionary biologists and psychologists. Waist-hip differential for young women, pre-pregnancy, is about 0.7. That is, the waist is about 7/10 of the size of the hips. For young men, it's about 0.85 or 0.9. So there's a difference. Men are more straight up and down, women are more curvy. The human attraction to women with a more or less hourglass figure and a small waist may well be hardwired into us. It certainly exists cross-culturally. In my apartment at home, I have a beautiful Nepalese statue of a heavenly nymph who is a perfect hourglass figure with naked breasts. And when my son was little, he and his friends used to come home and sort of stare googly-eyed at her. That's like the sort of eternal feminine. But there are other variations in ideals of beauty, such as breast size, bottom size, and overall weight. The corset, however, also had and acquired a number of other erotic associations. Manet, for example, declared that, quote, "The satin corset is the nude of our age." And here in this picture, he shows a famous actress wearing a blue satin corset, blue silk stockings, and lacy lingerie, all of which were extremely risque when he painted this painting in the 1870s. In fact, one art critic talked about how this was the underwear worn by the aristocracy of vice. And other writers talked about how respectable women wore pure white satin corsets, and that this kind of thing was only worn by courtesans and actresses. Of course, like all fashions, within less than a few years, colorful corsets and lacy lingerie were being worn by all the respectable ladies in Paris and around the world. But it was initially launched by women in the demi-monde. So here she is in this very sexy outfit. Let's look at the next picture. Cut to 100 years later, more than 100 years, to the very end of the 20th century, and you find, I think this was Lacroix. This, of course, it was by Christian Lacroix, and it shows again the appeal of the corset for emphasizing the hourglass figure, and also emphasizing the allure of underwear as outerwear, something that the Victorians didn't know about, but which came into fashion in the later 20th century, and also the sort of luxurious fantasies about lacing someone up. Could be a little bit SM fantasies. It could be romanticizing the idea of historical fashion, because nobody had to wear corsets in 1997. This was purely to make a statement for evening dress. This waist-hip differential of 0.7 continued to be the ideal for a variety of female figures in the 20th and 21st centuries. People as different as Twiggy, Marilyn Monroe, and the model Elle Macpherson all have about a 0.7 waist-hip differential, although the size of their breast, bottom, their overall weight, and body fat composition differed. So the waist-hip differential is one thing that shows it's a kind of sexual selection that improves your chances of getting your genes to move on. Because if your hominid ancestors have been attracted to women who were prepubescent, pregnant, or already past childbearing age, they wouldn't have had as many children. So your ideal was to have a nubile, fertile female. Okay, next image. Darwin's theory of sexual selection then places the emphasis on female choice as to which males are most attractive. It's the peacock. It's, you know, what that has the big tail. You notice in the bird world, the males are fancy and the females are brown and obscure so they can hide with the babies in the woods. The male peacock has the fancy tail. The male swordfish has the long sword. The male deer has the big antlers. Yet interestingly, most male scholars of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology focus almost exclusively on male preferences for particular female bodies, even claiming that women don't care much about men's appearance, and that evolution has led women to ignore handsome young men in favor of older men who are richer or more powerful or nicer or more reliable, etc. There may certainly be historical and socioeconomic reasons for such practical mate choices. Get the next one. But I have to wonder whether it's accidental that the human male has a bigger penis than a gorilla male. Or was this something that our hominid ancestors selected for? We get the next picture. There's a lot of evidence that not just homosexual men, but heterosexual women also prefer big pecs, cute butts, handsome chisel faces, and big penises. As Nancy Eckhoff points out, pectoral muscles are the human male's antlers. They're weapons of war, fighting with other males, but also they're weapons of seduction. Fashion has often emphasized or enhanced desirable male physical features. Jackets can enhance broad shoulders, while tight jeans enhance and emphasize impressive genitals, cute butts, etc. Next. Fashion has often been perceived as feminine, and historically, most psychoanalysts have attributed women's supposedly greater investment in fashion to their penis envy. They don't have a penis, so they show off all the other parts of their body. However, for centuries, elite men in Europe and everywhere else in the world tended to be at least as richly and fashionably dressed as women of the same class or milieu. The psychoanalyst J.C. Flugel was an interesting guy because he actually knew a lot about fashion history. And he knew that it was only at the end of the 18th century that men mostly gave up all of their fancy and fashionable dress to wear relatively sober suits. When he looked back, he saw that one of the most spectacular and sexualized fashions was worn by men, and that was the Renaissance codpiece, which was worn from the late 15th to the early 17th century. So not as long as the corset, but still more than a century. And Flugel perceived the codpiece as the most extreme example of phallic symbolism in clothing, and also as an example of phallic exhibitionism. Only, of course, there was what psychoanalysts call a displacement of affect from the ordinary naked penis, which is what your garden variety of exhibitionist pulls out, to the codpiece, which was often vividly colored and sometimes embellished by padding in such a way as to simulate a perpetual erection. Interestingly, cod was the contemporary English term for testicles, and the codpiece actually originated as a flap or bag that was intended to interject greater modesty into male fashion when men were wearing tights. And it was just this pad, this flap really, only gradually evolved into a padded penis. The literary scholar, Will Fisher, interprets this later, really phallic codpiece as a prosthetic device to materialize new ideas about masculinity. So, whereas the old kind equated masculinity with reproduction and the testicles, the new kind, the padded sheath style, linked masculinity with sexual conquest, and specifically with phallic penetration. So you have a real switch from reproduction to this kind of phallic penetration that's being acted out, as it were, with this codpiece. Get the next one. One aspect of fashion that's very significant involves the libido for looking. Whether you're the looking at someone that you find sexually attractive, as in this wonderful Granville illustration of Venus at the opera, where all the men's eyes are staring at her. So that's the active form of sexual gazing, and the passive form of wanting to be gazed at, one being voyeurism, the other exhibitionism. We get the next image. Freud did not write much about dress or fashion per se, nor did he develop a theory of fashion, but his ideas about sexuality and the libido for looking are important. And periodically he dropped little hints about dress that others such as Flugel later built into more elaborate theories. For example, Freud observed that, quote, in women, the inclination to passive exhibitionism is almost invariably buried under the imposing reactive function of sexual modesty, but not without a loophole being left for it in relation to clothes. And then, indicating an awareness that fashion is situated in time and space, he added, I need only hint at the elasticity and variability in the amount of exhibitionism that women are permitted to retain in accordance with differing conventions and circumstances. So back when Freud was a young man, women were allowed to show off the form of their bodies in tight form, exaggerating fashions, but their legs were hidden. And even towards evening, the bosom was the only part of the body that was partially exposed with a low décolletage. It was left for Flugel, this British psychoanalyst, to develop the first real Freudian interpretation of dress and fashion. And in his book, The Psychology of Clothes, published in 1930, he drew on Freud's idea of a loophole left for exhibitionism to argue that the unconscious conflict between exhibitionism and modesty was displaced from the naked body onto clothing, which then functioned as a compromise, since it both covered the body, or most of it, and attracted attention to it. Thus, our entire attitude towards a dress is ambivalent. In that way, he said it resembled certain neurotic symptoms, which are also kind of a compromise. So this brilliant idea, which Flugel called clothes ambivalence, makes it possible to look at both men's and women's clothes in terms of a kind of sartorial exhibitionism. Freud didn't like to think of men as being passive. He always associated passiveness with women. But obviously a man wearing a codpiece or tight jeans is wanting to passively, as it were, expose himself to others. We get the next picture. Flugel went on and said, perhaps the most obvious and important of all the variations of fashion is that which concerns the part of the body which is most accentuated. For example, he said, in the 1920s, legs have emerged after centuries of shrouding, and women's arms were also increasingly bared, part of a modern accentuation of the body that he related to a cultural idealization of youth. And he was, sort of middle-aged in the 1920s and was very much attuned to the changes that were happening to fashion in the 20s. He was actually even part of a men's dress reform movement, which said that, women were catching up and showing off more of their bodies. Men ought to do the same thing too. And he thought men should be wearing shorts, for example, instead of long trousers. That idea didn't go very far except on vacation and at the beach. Most people in the 20s were kind of horrified by that idea. We get the next image. Flugel is often credited with inventing the term the shifting erogenous zone, but this was actually popularized by a fashion curator, James Laver, who wrote that, according to Laver, women's fashion seduces by means of selectively exposing or emphasizing the different erotic zones of the female body. And he wrote, once a focus of interest loses its appeal, another one has to be found. In the early 1930s, the emphasis shifted from the legs to the back. Now, this idea of the shifting erogenous zone has seemed plausible to many people, but it's ultimately unconvincing. For one thing, there's absolutely no evidence that heterosexual men ever get bored with breasts or legs. Fashion's emphasis in the 30s on the back came from two sources. One was the new popularity of sunbathing, and you had bathing suits which were very low in back. And so you had the idea of having dresses that were low in back. And even more important was the new morality code for Hollywood films, the Hays Code, which restricted films from showing too much of an actress's breasts, thus leading to a new focus on the back. Next. Flawed as it was, the theory of the shifting erogenous zone was quickly picked up by journalists who repeated it for decades. After all, fashion does focus on different parts of the body at different times, just not because these are new erotic zones. Eroticism in fashion involves subtleties and ambiguities which such a crude theory ignores. We get the next image. So when Calvin Klein, for example, was asked about his sliver of bare midriff fashions in his spring 1990 collection, and this is not from that collection, this is another later collection also showing a sliver at the waist, Klein said, "It's sexy, but it's not too revealing. A woman could wear these dresses in a public place like a restaurant without attracting too much attention. It's the next step in body-conscious dressing, showing some skin, but not too much." Next. Freud's big book, the first big book, The Interpretation of Dreams, had a huge success with artists. The Surrealist artists were among the first to focus on it. They sought to draw on the unconscious sexual drives and fantasies, including those that assimilated clothes to parts of the body. You'll recognize this painting by Magritte. Next. And Salvador Dali took the idea of clothes symbolism, particularly phallic symbolism, as expressed in his shoe hat, which is the product of a collaboration with the fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli. Next. It went along with a jacket that had lips appliqued around the entrance to the pocket. Next. And a trompe-l'oeil dress, the tear dress, where there were trompe-l'oeil rips in the fabric, revealing somewhat bruised-looking flesh underneath. These kinds of surreal fashions disrupted the perfect image of femininity that was created by other designers, next, such as Madeleine Vianney, who created this kind of body-worshipping gown. Dresses like these position the woman as the object of male desire. Next. Meanwhile, Coco Chanel drew on the authority of the masculine wardrobe, creating the look of an androgynous dandy style for the modern woman. She was no feminist, but she drew on the styles that her upper-class male patrons and boyfriends wore. In fact, she once told Salvador Dali, speaking about herself in the third person, all she ever did was translate the masculine into the feminine in clothes. Here you see sort of the little black dress as a kind of armor, and the dandy image as another alternative to the image of sort of the traditionally feminine body. Next. Now, nakedness can be linked clearly to vulnerability, as you can see in this other surrealist painting by Magritte, where a naked woman is attacked by her other half, a kind of a clothed male. And Freud has some interesting things to talk about, to sort of bisexual fantasy imagery. Next. But as the French psychoanalyst Didier Anzieux observed in his really important book, The Skin Ego, the skin exists as both an organic and an imaginary order. It's a real part of your anatomical body. In fact, it's the largest organ, but it's also the site of fantasies. And one fantasy is how our real skin is a containing envelope for what's inside of us, and our clothes can act in that same kind of containing, holding way. Next. So some items of clothing softly touch the skin, while others hold the body in a comforting embrace that can recall the way a mother might have held you as an infant. I think we can imagine other ways too that fashion contains or unifies what could be an anxious, fragmented sense of self, which all of us feel at some time, that we're coming apart at the seams and we need something that will help pull us together. Next. Just as the skin offers at least some protection against physical trauma, external aggression, and social and psychological penetration, the skin ego also functions as a protective barrier for the psyche. So certain garments like a biker's black leather jacket or Chanel little black dress or heavy boots are clearly ways to protect yourself against, as it were, the other people's evil eye looking at you in a way which is hostile. Next. Sometimes the best protection seems to be really to hide, and this Comme des Garçons outfit is an extreme artistic example, but I think we can think of many other outfits that perform similar functions. You have only to think about pulling on a baseball cap or a hoodie and slinking down. There are many clothes that you can hide into. Next. This noir outfit by another great Japanese designer is more overtly aggressive with its spikes, its protection against external aggression, as well as being, sort of acting aggressively to keep people away from you. And in fact, I know shy people who've told me that their extreme fashions are explicitly intended to tell people to back off, that, their clothes that say, don't bother me and I won't bother you. Don't F with me and I won't F with you. And I think that that's an important part of protective dressing. Next. The skin ego also functions as a filter of exchanges and a surface of inscription. And so if tattooing and other forms of body modification are more or less permanent means of inscribing messages on the skin, we get the next image. Brands in fashion are a temporary and easily replaceable system of communicating, sometimes directly, as with message t-shirts and logos, or here where it says Gucci Balenciaga all over the suit, or more obliquely via social and sartorial codes. So fashion or the skin ego can also function to emphasize you as an individual, to show that you have your own skin, you sexualize your body, etc. Next. According to Anzieu, when an individual's skin ego or feeling of themselves being able to hold themselves together is not strong and flexible enough, quote, the slightest narcissistic wound makes a tear in it. Somebody looks at you in a mean way. Somebody rolls their eyes at what you're wearing or makes fun of you, and you get this narcissistic wound. Then he says it's sometimes necessary to reinforce the outside of the skin ego, quote, with a symbolic maternal skin, analogous to the shield of Zeus, or those stunning showy rags in which the young female models, often anorexic, drape themselves, the splendor of which re-narcissizes them temporarily in the face of the constant threat that the psychic container may disintegrate. Or as the American psychoanalyst Eve Golden puts it, when people feel narcissistically deficient, they may seek clothes as a way to make good the lack, relying on the clothes at once for a proud display and a concealment of shame. We tend to think of narcissism as being all bad, like pathological narcissism, but a degree of narcissism is necessary to feel good about yourself. Next image. I'm just going to go through some other ideas here. For example, questions of sexuality are central to psychoanalysis, as well as to the study of fashion. And both psychoanalysis and fashion are intimately associated with the body, sexuality, gender, and eroticism. Freud's analysis of sexual symbolism can be reductive, and his interpretation of it can be very sexist and phallocentric. He sees everything as being in terms of phallic symbols. The shoe is a phallic symbol, but it's also a vaginal symbol into which the phallic foot is thrust. The high heel is a phallic symbol, the pointed toe is a phallic symbol, etc. Actually, I think that there's a lot of truth to that for men. But I think that when women have a closet full of high heels, they're not asking for a closet full of phallic symbols. If I can quote one sexist against another. In Woody Allen's movie Zelig, the character Zelig says, "I worked with Freud in Vienna. We broke over the concept of penis envy. He thought it should be limited to women," end quote. Now, actually, penis envy is what he's implying is something that really applies a lot to men who are envious of first dad's bigger penis, but then also the anxiety in locker rooms that other people have bigger penises. So I do think that high heels appeal to men in part because of fantasies about the phallic woman, who is like this sexually omnivorous, powerful, and always ready woman. You talk to analysts and psychiatrists of all kinds, and they'll tell you the phallic woman is the ubiquitous fantasy, male sexual fantasy. And the high heel could be part of that. The high heels worn by sexy women, right? Sexy, sometimes dominant women, women who really are interested in sex, etc. Next image. What's a phallic symbol? I remember a friend of mine telling me about a little boy in Washington, D.C., who ran into the living room with a tiny little heart on. And he said to his mother, "Look, Mommy, look, I'm the Washington Monument." This is a perfect example of male sexual fantasies about phallic symbols. And the idea that it is something massive and hard. Next image. Fetishism also has to do with the sex appeal of the inorganic. The idea that an item of clothing could take the ordinary, perhaps kind of mundane, let's face it, not always erect, perfect, fabulous body, and turn it into something which is like a godlike, is fabulous. So whether it's the shoe, the glove, the corset, the black leather jacket, the jeans, the motorcycle boot, it's something that can turn you into or make you look like something more than you necessarily are. And also, since the human body is not just a sexy body, it's also a fallible body. It's a frail body. It's a body that gets old and sick and that dies. And let's face it, fashion doesn't die. It goes out of fashion, but that's why it's born again. In fact, fashion is kind of like a vampire. It's undead. It's constantly reborn and coming out anew. Next. The corset is a phallic symbol because it turns the fleshy, soft body into something hard and erect. Next. It's the cover of my book, Fetish. I remember I talked to some leather fetishists when I was working on this book, and I said, "What do you think of the Versace collection? All the leather bondage gear." And they said, "We hate it." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because people used to wear these clothes to show that's the kind of sex they like, and now it's just a fashion statement." And I said, "Well, you guys, you just got to suck it up, because any cool looking fashion from subculture, whether a hippie fashion, a punk fashion, a fetish fashion, will be assimilated by the fashion system. It will just be hoovered up like a vacuum cleaner and turned into fashion because it looks so good." Next image. Here, voila. These were the Dietrich clothes that they were so offended by, because these clothes made you look like you were really into S&M. And in fact, the newspaper reports journalists were wringing their hands about this, and they were going, is it chic or is it cruel? Is it showing women as a dominatrix or women as the slave of male sexual fantasies? What's going on with this? Next. In the early 21st century, John Galliano did a collection called Freud or Fetish. And at that point, he was the artistic director at Christian Dior. And he told a journalist, he said, Christian Dior was the first fetishist designer. Those high heels, those corsets, the big skirts, it was all fetish stuff. Now, Dior was not the first fetishist designer. He was probably not a fetishist at all, except in the sense that some psychiatrists like Robert Stoller say that fetishizing is the norm for men. But certainly the look of Dior's clothes fit in with a lot of the most popular fetishes, which focused on ultra feminine clothes that could also be interpreted as having phallic symbolism for men. Next. So here you have Galliano's show was so fascinating. It started with a married couple, mom and dad, except dad is wearing a green carnation, and things start to get wonky fairly quickly. Next. And he talks about how, both mom and dad are actually having affairs with the chauffeur, who's this very androgynous figure worn by a female model. And then there's even better, this incredible, amazing image, the next one, which is this terrifying crocodile woman. And for this, I have to read you a quote, which is from Lacan. Hold on, let me find this for you. Okay, this is from the French Freud, this French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Jacques Lacan. And he wrote, again, about the family romance, the parents. He writes, "The mother is a big crocodile, and you find yourself in her mouth. You never know what may set her off, suddenly making those jaws clamp down. That's the mother's desire. There's a roller," that's a big stick, made of stone, of course, which is potentially there at the level of the trap and which holds and jams it open, so it keeps her from closing her mouth on you. That's what we call the phallus. It's a roller that protects you should the jaws suddenly close. So this kind of hilarious, over-the-top image of the terrifying phallic woman who's like this crocodile, and then the father's phallus, or the idea of that, which is going to protect you. So you can see this is such a phallocentric fantasy. It's completely disregarding of female sexuality, but very often it does hit onto things that little boys may think about and which may exist still as unconscious fantasies for men. Next. Freud initially proposed that we were governed by the pleasure principle, that we want pleasure and we don't want pain. We have to sometimes face up to reality and the reality principle, and we do things we don't want to because we have to. Later on, though, he also came up with the idea of the death drive, which was very controversial, which is more than just aggression. It's about real destruction and just sort of the life and death drives fighting against each other. And it's a concept which is very complicated because others have talked about how the death drive is also part of the sex drive. So here in this particular dress, as I'm working on a show about fashion and psychoanalysis, I'm trying to show how you have this life and erotic symbolism in the roses and flowers are the sex organs of plants, and then the death drive with these images of razor blades. So next, just the last couple of images here. Here you see this Alaya snakeskin outfit, which shows literally a second skin taken from the snake, and the idea that the writer J.G. Ballard said once that he defined fashion as nature's way of demonstrating that we have one skin too few. And here in something like this, that this makes you more desirable, but it's also a form of protection. Something I want to come back to in a minute as my closing words. The next one. Here we have a fabulous dress by Jenny Dutton, who's an artist, and I'm trying to commission her to make another one of these. It's made out of actual human hair that she gathered at hairdressers from around England. And you know the story of Lady Godiva, where she hid her nakedness under her long hair. So the hair formed a kind of clothing. Next. From the era of surrealism, you get these human-like dress forms, and then the eye. And, you know, I talked earlier about how clothing is like a second skin, but I want to emphasize now the power of the power of the eye and of looking, and how our clothes draw attention to us, want people to look at us, and yet also turn them away when they're looking in the wrong way. So let's look at the last image, which is of Karl Lagerfeld wearing glasses. And In an interview with Carla Bruni, Lagerfeld said, "Vulnerability is foreign to me." And you look, oh, really? Those sunglasses are kind of a way of protecting people from looking into your eyes. You're dressed from neck to feet, even your hands are covered. And when he talked about his childhood in this and other interviews, he talked about his mother was immensely narcissistic and often very cruel. You know, she'd say, "Talk fast, everything you say is so boring, I'm leaving the room." Or she'd say, "Oh, your hands are so ugly," and etc. So one of the reasons he talked so fast is he was trying to get it all out before she would leave the room. And when he talked about his vulnerability and his childhood, the French psychoanalyst Pascal Navari started to wonder about this particular look, which is that of fashion. Because remember, we call fashion dresses on a runway looks, look 1, look 2, look 3. And the connections between fashion and the fragility, the vulnerability we sometimes feel when others look at us. We remember the terms like fashion victim, fashion police, fashion disaster. As Lagerfeld described his childhood, Navari thought that behind each new collection of his hides a ferocious maternal eye and an internal dialogue with an implacable ideal. He could never be good enough for her. He said, she never said thank you to anyone. She was only interested in herself. And one of the foundations of his success in fashion, she argued, was his child's need to seize and hold the attention of a profoundly narcissistic mother. But more importantly, beyond the psychology of one individual designer, does this not also help explain why fashion has so much power over all of us? Fashion, she suggests, causes us to be visible, even in the face of the world's indifference, while also providing us with protective dark glasses that hide our vulnerability. As Navari says, quote, "What the look of fashion exposes is, at the same time, our vulnerability about being seen and of not being seen." Because we're vulnerable having people look at us the wrong way, but we certainly want them to see us. We don't want their eyes to go right past us at a party. So in this way, fashion is fulfilling very complicated psychological needs. So now I'm going to look at my chat thing, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry I can't be here with you in person to hear your questions, but let me try and see if they're, it's not in the chat, something else, Valerie. Your questions?
Thank you so much. That was a spectacular talk. You touched on so many different things that we've talked on during the whole day. That really great talk. So, so we have an opportunity for people to ask questions. You can type your questions in the question and answer box, which is down at the bottom of your screen.
And I'm not seeing that here. Oh, wait, so here it is. I got it. I see it. Okay, first question. I hate the way the electricity in my office.
Yeah, you're staying late and getting put in the dark whenever
I get put in the dark every 2 minutes. Okay, how did I get into fashion? By accident. I was at Yale studying European cultural history, and a classmate gave a talk about the corset, and I suddenly had my epiphany, and I realized fashion's part of culture. I can do fashion history. Second question. How can fashion help push the boundaries of beauty to not be so fatophobic, white, and ableist? Good question. Because fashion has, well, fashion itself is nothing. There's no point in reifying fashion. We're the ones who make fashion. Designers make it, but we're the ones who decide what sells by buying it. So it's really up to us to help push the boundaries of fashion. And that means not only, partly it means pushing designers to put people who look like all of us on the runway. That's part of it. Because I was just talking to a French psychologist, not a psychoanalyst, and she was saying that something huge, like 90% of the people that she surveyed did not feel represented by fashion. They weren't thin enough, they weren't white enough, they weren't tall enough. And so people have been pushing designers to show differently abled people and people with different body types and different races on the runway. But it's not just that, it's also getting all of those people involved in the fashion industry as designers, as photographers, as editors, as retailers, and really sort of for all of us to vote with that and say, which fashion designers are making an effort? Which ones do you want to support? And which one? For a start, you can look at the ones that have the most egregious advertising and say, I don't want to be associated with that. I want to find somebody who seems to actually like people like me. Who are my personal fashion heroes? Well, I really love Rick Owens. I think Rick Owens is somebody who's definitely pushed against the ideas of a sort of standard beauty. I mean, he was a very sort of effeminate gay boy in Southern California when he invented his kind of half grunge, half glamour kind of fashion that he took to Paris. And he's certainly breaking down a lot of gender barriers as well with the idea of men in high heels and skirts. I mean, he's been very, very aggressively pushing towards expanding that kind of boundary. So he's one of my favorites. I'm trying to think, well, the late Isabel Toledo was one of my all-time favorites. I still keep bringing her clothes back in to be repaired and copied because I love them so much. But I'm an old woman, you know, in New York. I'm wear like black all the time. I have a very particular kind of ninja kind of look. Everybody needs to decide for themselves which kind of designer. I admire a lot of designers that I don't necessarily wear. I mean, if you like Versace, Versace is fantastic, and I think Donatella's doing a great job. Nobody thought she could do it after Gianni died, but it's not the kind of fashion that I wear personally. What else?
Let's see, do we have any other questions people would like to ask?
Maybe you're ready to go off and have a drink at the end of the day.
Well, Dr. Steele, thank you so much for participating in our Brown Symposium. This was a great way to end the day. Thank you so much for participating. I'd like to just take a moment to thank all of our speakers for participating in the Brown Symposium. I want to thank the Southwestern faculty that introduced the speakers. Also want to give a heartfelt thanks for Laura Polanco, our administrative assistant, who handled many of the administrative details of this year's Brown Symposium. She stepped into this role just in the last several weeks and has worked incredibly hard during the last few days. And I want to thank all the people in the audience for joining us in this year's Brown Symposium. For those of you on campus, I want to welcome you to now attend the art exhibition that accompanies the Brown Symposium. This exhibition is entitled Plush, and it's been curated by Ron Geibel and organized by Seth Dalton. It'll take place in the Fine Arts Gallery, and we have some refreshments there as well. So I hope that if you're on campus, you'll head over to the Fine Arts Building for this exhibition. Thanks again for attending this year's Brown Symposium. We really appreciate your participation. We hope that you'll join us for next year's Brown Symposium.